the head of Paramount, Charles Bloodhorn, I think his name was, he found out where she was, and he flew out there and met with her in her hotel room. And he said, I will take care of your studio. I will take care of your people. You can do this. And so she came back, and there's a picture in my book of her cutting the ribbon in between the two lots. They tore the wall down, and Paramount's taken it over. And she just looks so traumatized. She's trying to force a smile on her face, but it's breaking her heart because that's all she had left of her marriage. Well, Paramount comes in, and they immediately cut Star Trek's budget. And then they cut it again for the third season. And so now, instead of having 8 days to shoot, now they got 7 days. And then they only got 6. And then they only have 5.5 to shoot an episode. That's why the quality came down in the last year, or the last part of the last year, because the budget was slashed so horribly that they just couldn't shoot on the scale that they were shooting before.
Yeah, I noticed, too. So, I noticed some of the props and stuff towards the end. Even the props and everything wasn't, standard like, years before.
No, they didn't have the money. And also the pacing of the show got slower because, every scene is a lighting setup. Every scene is a new set, even if it's sets that are already built, like the Enterprise sets. You got to move to that set. You got to light it. It's time. It's money. And when you're doing alien planets, you got to build the planets, and that's lighting setups, and they got to go from stage 9 to stage 10. Stage 9 was the Enterprise sets, and stage 10 was the planet sets. And you lose hours and hours. You got to move everything over there, and you got to light it, and you got to build it, and everything else. So in the last half of the third year, they didn't have the money to do this. They didn't have the money for guest stars. They didn't have the crew. The ship looked like a ghost town. There weren't as many extras in the corridors. They just didn't have the money. And poor Bob Justman, who had been there since the first pilot, and he was co-producer of the third season. He was associate producer previously. He left at that point when they still had about a dozen episodes to do. He left because his heart was so broken, and he wrote a memo, and he said, we're trying to do half a science fiction movie a week on the budget of a radio show.
Oh, wow.
And it was just that difficult. And Fred Freeberger's gotten a lot of blame. They said, well, he produced the third season, and he must not have been any good. He was really doing an amazing job holding that show together in the worst time slot of the week with the budget chopped off. And at that point, NBC wasn't even returning his phone calls. They had pretty much wanted to get rid of Star Trek, and nobody was talking to him. It was just a very difficult chore that he went through. And that's Volume 3 of this 3-book set, one for each season. And if you read Volume 3, I think you'll really feel for Freddie Freeberger, and you'll realize that he did a yeoman's job in that. The scripts were just as good, but by the time they rewrote them and took stuff out, well, we can't afford this and we can't afford that, and let's have a 10-minute briefing room scene because we can't do all these different lighting setups. So the energy of the scripts was sucked out and so forth. And they had some wonderful premises. There was one of the last episodes of the third year was a thing called Mark of Gideon about overpopulation. There was another taboo subject that they were tackling back then, and the network was afraid, well, you can get us in trouble with Catholics, and different people are going to be offended by this episode. We'll get letters, my God, and all that. There was a wonderful scene that was in the script because the whole point of this is this planet can't do birth control, but they never tell you why. I mean, they're packed together, they're all shoved together, and you see that, and it's kind of horrific. And they bring Kirk onto a duplicate fake Enterprise so that he can have sex with this woman and give her a virus that will make her people sick, and they'll start dying off. Well, right there, we're saying they're going to have sex. They don't want to do that on NBC. But also, you're talking about overpopulation. They don't want to do that. But they allow these two things to fly. The thing they took out was the whole reason this race couldn't have birth control. There's a scene in there, in the script, and I believe they shot the scene as well, but it was edited out of the show. It's on the shooting schedule, but whether it was actually filmed or not, who knows, because NBC would come to the set and say, stop, and they'd pull the plug on these things, like they tried to do on the Interracial Kiss. But she burns a finger off by touching a Bunsen burner in McCoy's lab. She doesn't know what it is, and her finger gets burned off on camera. And Kirk races over to bandage it for her, because they're the only two on the ship that he knows of. And he goes over to try to bandage it so she doesn't bleed to death. And while he takes her hand, and while he's holding her hand and trying to put a bandage on, the finger grows back. And this is why they can't have birth control, because they can't sterilize anybody, because it'll just regenerate. And so by taking that out of the episode, you miss the whole point of the episode. So this is the stuff they were dealing with in that third year. Now, actually through the whole show, but especially then.
Now, Mark, I got to ask you a question here. Now, was that where they would go into a machine and they would, disappear? That's how they're getting rid of the population?
No, that was a different one called A Taste of Armageddon in the first year. Very interesting episode, because that was about war being so sanitized.
Oh, yeah, that's right.
That the bombs are all generated by computer. It's like playing a computer game. And so the other side said, well, we just launched an attack that got through your defenses, and it blew up this part of your city, and 10,000 people were killed. So they would take 10,000 of their own people and put them into these disintegration chambers, because if they didn't, they would have to start making real bombs. They had taken war to the level to where nothing got destroyed. You didn't destroy buildings and destroy atmospheres and everything else. By the two planets agreeing that whenever the computers say that you successfully made a strike, we will exterminate so many people, disintegrate them. And Kirk damages the whole system, pulls the plug on it. And they say, do you realize what you've done? And he says, yes, I brought back the horror of war. And now maybe you'll have a reason to stop it. You know, these are the messages that Star Trek had.
Yeah,
Gene Roddenberry made sure there was a strong theme in every episode. He had a statement to make in every single episode.
Oh, he did. Hey, one of the listeners is asking a question of you, Mark. Was it true that Leonard Nimoy was a prankster on the set?
No. William Shatner was the prankster. And they did a lot of pranks against poor Leonard. They would hide his bike up in the rafters, because they would ride bikes between the sound stages and things like that. They were always trying to crack him up, always trying to get him to break character, because the minute those ears went on, he became so serious. You couldn't even get him to smile. He would be laughing before the ears went on, but when they went on, he stayed in character. Now, there are pictures out there of Spock grinning from ear to ear, but those are very rare, because he tried so hard not to break character even when they're not shooting. He would just get into that zone. And so Shatner, who was a real prankster, was always trying to get Nimoy, always playing tricks on him and trying to bust him up. So that's the truth behind that story.
Oh, okay. R.W. Wells, now you know the real truth, that Leonard Nimoy wasn't the prankster. He was the one that was getting pranks on him.
That's right.
So, moving along, more interesting behind the scene notes here.
Do you have more questions?
Oh, yeah. Any more dirt on, the production?
Okay. Yeah. I didn't know if you had more of your...
No.
Because I didn't know if your computer was working.
Actually, one of them isn't.
Well, Nimoy almost didn't come back for the second season. He was getting paid $1,250 an episode during the first season. He was the second banana, but he was getting more fan mail than Shatner. So when the second season came up, his agent said, "You can't go back for this. You got to let me cut a new deal for you." And so they demanded a raise, and Desilu said, "We're already over budget. We're not going to give him more money." And they said, "Well, then he's not going to come up." And on April 1st, 1967, the first day they were back in the office to start putting together the second season, Gene Roddenberry wrote a memo to Gene Coon saying, "This is no April Fool's joke. We're going to have to go forward without Mr. Spock." And so they hired Lawrence Montaigne, I think his last name was pronounced, and he was going to be the new Vulcan on the Enterprise. And in the last minute, NBC stepped forward. NBC, who didn't want Nimoy in the first place, they didn't want Spock in the first place. They thought he looked too demonic, and they thought it would scare away a lot of their affiliates and viewers. They realized at this point that he was getting more mail than the monkeys were getting, who had their show on NBC at that point. And so they came forward and said, "You got to get Nimoy back, whatever it takes." So they gave him a raise. I think they doubled his salary to $2,500 an episode, half of what Shatner was making, and he came back. And so Lawrence, who I interviewed, they gave him a small part in the episode of Muck Time where he played a Vulcan. So that was his consolation prize. But he was supposed to be the new Vulcan on the Enterprise. And I didn't know that until I started going through the show files, so that's why I assume most people don't know that. And there's a great letter in there that Leonard Nimoy wrote to them telling them why he was not going. And he said, he was such a fair man. He wrote to them and he said, "I am not going to come back unless you do a deal with my agent. And I just want to let you know so you can do what you need to do. I don't want to stick you guys to where you think I'm going to show up on Monday and I'm not there. So I'm just letting you know, not as a threat, but so that you can make whatever arrangements you need to make to continue," because he cared about the show. And so he gave them that heads up. The letter's in Volume 2 for Season 2 and so forth. Something with the new book that just came out, which covers the 1970s. After the show gets canceled and the long trek of coming back, the conventions building, the syndication, boom and syndication going up, the animated series, and then finally Star Trek the Motion Picture. And it was a long wait, and you find out why. It was Paramount. Wouldn't allow the show to go back into production. NBC wanted it. 2 years after they canceled it, they tried to get it back on the network in prime time. Paramount wouldn't give it to them because they said, "We're making so much money on the reruns, if we put it back in production, the bottom's going to fall out," which is insane. But they actually believed that. And but NBC wanted it back because the reruns were beating their new shows.
Oh, wow.
And the other networks wanted something like that too. And so they went to Roddenberry and they said, "Well, Paramount won't let us have Star Trek. Will you give us something like Star Trek?" So he made Genesis 2, he made Quester tapes, he made these different pilots. And he got some knocks by the critics. They said, "Well, this feels a little Star Trek-y. He's running out of ideas." It's not true. It's all in the memos. You can read them in the books. The studios and the networks were asking him to make it as much like Star Trek as he could. Like Quester tapes was about an android who has no emotion, and he's on Earth trying to save the human race from itself. Leonard Nimoy was hired to play that character. He was going to star in the show. He was under contract with Universal. And at the last minute, Universal switched and decided to go with Robert Foxworth instead, who they had signed to a contract, because Nimoy's contract was running out. He said he wasn't going to renew. He would do the show, but he wasn't going to stay an exclusive player for the studio. So they said, "He's out, the other guy's in." But they told Roddenberry, "Don't tell him. We'll tell him. He works for us. He's under contract with us. We get to tell him, not you." Well, Leonard was on the lot, and he ran into the director, and the director said, "Too bad you're not going to be in the show." And Leonard called Gene and said, "Thanks for telling me." And Gene said, "I think it's terrible. I think it's terrible. I've been fighting them." And he said, "Yeah, sure you have." And for the rest of their lives, Leonard didn't trust Gene. They kind of had an adversarial relationship during the making of the movies. And when I was going through the Roddenberry vault, through all the letters and memos for this new book, I found out that Gene Roddenberry did fight for Leonard Nimoy, and he quit the show. He said, "I'm not going to produce it. I wrote it with Gene Kuhn. I'm supposed to produce it. If you take Leonard Nimoy out of this, I'm not going to do it." And the president of Universal wrote back to him and said, "Okay, so you're saying we have to choose between you and Robert Foxworth. We're going to go with Foxworth." They did that to Gene Roddenberry on a show he created, and they were going to go forward without it. And they said, "We'll keep you on as a consultant. We'll pay you your executive producer salary. Just be a consultant." And he said, "I'll do that, but that's all I'm going to do if you don't put Nimoy in." And Leonard had passed away about 6 months before when I found this letter, because I so much would have wanted to have called him and told him about this, that Gene did not betray him like he always thought. It was the studio. But that's the way they were treating Gene Roddenberry. They would bring him in to make shows, and then they would mess the shows up. And every one of his pilots sold. Every one of them was supposed to go to series, and he ended up quitting each of them because the networks would mess them up so bad that he said, I cannot